Okay, I wondered if I was going to have any company today. Thank you. Make it worth your while, talk a little bit about the final exam. Scheduled for Thursday, the 18th, at the ungodly hour of 7 in the evening. Just lucky, I guess. We'll be over, the nice thing, the good news is we'll be in a wonderful room, the big auditorium in the Li Ka-shing building, which is a brand new building. Very nicely outfitted, very comfortable seats, 245 Li Ka-shing. For those of you who are DSP students, I don't have the arrangements for your proctoring yet, but DSP's never failed us. I'll get those arrangements to you as soon as I get them. The exam period is for 3 hours. That's a standard Berkeley final exam period. But the exam itself is constructed as a 2-hour exam. The first hour will be a non-cumulative exam, essentially a second midterm. That'll cover the materials since the first midterm. And the second hour will be a cumulative final. That'll give you a chance to kind of reflect on the course as a whole. Again, it's intended to be a 2-hour exam, but you will have 3 hours for it, so that we'll still be going until 10 o'clock. We'll do a review session during the RRR period on Wednesday the 10th here in this room during our regular class hour. And before that, I'll have a narrative review updated and posted to the course website. And as always, there will be a special discussion board for questions prior to questions about the final exam. Just for the record, there's the material that's going to be covered, the non-cumulative stuff, material since the midterm, and the cumulative stuff will include references to these other things, including the Lodge book, which we haven't talked about yet. I'll talk about a little bit on Wednesday, and you'll be talking about in your discussion sections next week. And then finally, just a reminder, questions posted by Wednesday, that would be the 17th, will be answered by the end of that business day, and all the usual resources are available. All right, this course is about consciousness. Spent a lot of time talking about what consciousness is. And when you finally break it down, consciousness consists in 3 different things. First, the very existence of what we call phenomenal experience, that we have mental states, that there's something it's like to see something or hear something or taste something. There's something it's like to see red as opposed to seeing blue. The second aspect of consciousness is what the philosophers call intentionality, which is the fact that our mental states are about something other than themselves. When we see and hear and taste and smell, we're seeing, hearing, tasting, and smelling things that are out there in the world. And what we're doing with our mental states is forming internal mental representations of these things that are outside the mind. And then finally, something we haven't talked about all that much is what the philosophers and psychologists and cognitive scientists call metaconsciousness, which is the idea that every individual's consciousness is his or her own. It's private, and we can reflect on our conscious mental states, and also that we can control our conscious mental states. To some extent, we can control what we think about and what we feel and what we want and all of that. Today and Monday, what we want to do is to consider where this comes from, where consciousness comes from. And that's essentially a developmental question. And in psychology and cognitive science, we can view development in three quite different ways. The first of these is what we call the phylogenetic, the viewpoint, which traces the development of some trait or characteristic across species, trying to look for species differences and species similarities to understand how some trait evolved over the course of evolutionary time. And the trait in question in this course, of course, is the trait of consciousness, okay, that characteristic. The second viewpoint is what's known as the ontogenetic viewpoint, which focuses not on the evolution of some trait across broad periods of time, but rather on the development of some trait or the emergence of some trait within the individual species member. And this is a topic of developmental psychology, and especially of a brand of developmental psychology we call lifespan developmental psychology, which goes past infancy and childhood and even adolescence to cover middle age and old age and the like. And then finally, not as much talked about in psychology as it should be, is the cultural view of development, which basically tries to put the development of some trait in the context of the society or culture in which the individual is embedded. So the general idea here is that as society or culture developed, so might the characteristics of consciousness have developed as well. This is essentially a Marxist idea about development, that political and economic development of the society affects the individual development or the mental development of the individual, but it's not completely associated with Marx. There are a lot of psychologists who take an interest in the relationship between individuals' modes of thinking and their surrounding culture, and with consciousness, that's no exception, as you'll see on Wednesday. First, let's lay some foundation here, because as you'll remember, Descartes posited that consciousness was uniquely human characteristic, that animals, non-human animals, did not have anything like consciousness. He basically argued that animals were reflex machines operating solely by means of innate, uncontrollable, involuntary responses to various kinds of stimuli. But, good son of the church that he was, Descartes postulated that humans had souls. We were embodied with souls that gave us both our minds, by which he meant consciousness, and also gave us free will. For Descartes, human existence was the highest stage of existence, except for God and angels themselves, and there was a qualitative difference between humans and other animals, and that qualitative difference actually consisted in the fact that humans had minds and other animals simply did not. This Cartesian understanding of the evolution of mind, which didn't have an understanding of evolution at all, in fact, was shattered in the 19th century by Charles Darwin, of course, beginning with his treatise on the origin of species. And as you know, as everybody knows, Darwin argued that various characteristics of animals and humans evolved as they tried to adapt to whatever environment they were put in. The general idea here is that all species are descended from common ancestors, that we and dogs and cats have some ancestor in common way back in evolutionary time. For the most part, Darwin applied this doctrine of evolution by natural selection to physical features, and he used that to account for morphological the similarities between various kinds of species. We have 2 arms and 2 legs, and so do chimpanzees, and so do gorillas, and fish have 4 fins, and all the way back. But implied in Darwin's work, and made very clear in later work, like his work on emotions, was the idea that this principle of evolutionary continuity applied to mental traits as well as physical traits. Darwin made this very clear in a later book on the descent of man, where he said, the difference in mind between man and the higher animals, great as it is certainly one of degree and not of kind. So here Darwin is clearly postulating that there's a continuity between the minds of humans and the minds of other animals, and that means there ought to be continuity of consciousness as well. Now, it's worth pointing out that Darwin did not completely embrace this concept of evolutionary continuity. If you're going to argue for evolutionary continuity, you've got to argue that every human physical trait and every human mental trait has its foreshadowing or its counterpart or whatever in the characteristics of other animals. But at least with respect to one human trait, Darwin seemed to say no. So if it could be proved that certain high mental powers, blah blah blah, were absolutely peculiar to man. Okay, if it could be proved that certain higher mental powers were absolutely peculiar to man, he said it's either by virtue of some kind of weird accident in evolution, or the result of the continued use of a perfect language. So here, I think Darwin is actually backing off from his assertion about evolutionary continuity. And a statement like this actually implies that human language is qualitatively different from the communication faculties of other animals, and that qualitative difference is one that can't be accounted for by evolution. Somebody once said, I can't remember who now, that language is an embarrassment for the theory of evolution because you can't find anything remotely resembling human language in any other species. Be that as it may, Darwin did make this strong assertion of evolutionary the continuity. Here's another kind of qualified example. We talked about this one before. Thomas Huxley, Darwin's cousin, also known as Darwin's bulldog, because of his fierce defense of the theory of evolution, when in his statement of epiphenomenalism, talked about how the consciousness of brutes had no causal powers. Okay, because they're just like the steam coming out of a steam whistle. But the very fact that he had to talk about the consciousness of brutes suggests that he thought that the consciousness of humans might, in fact, have causal powers. Okay, and if so, that's a qualitative difference between humans and other animals. In any event, all of this gets picked up in the latter part of the 19th century by a series of psychologists who invented a discipline known as comparative psychology, whose goal is to compare the mental and behavioral traits of humans and other species with each other to try to fit them into some kind of evolutionary scheme of things. And the first figure of interest here is George John Romanes, who in a book argued that, in a book called Animal Intelligence, in fact, argued that even very, very primitive-seeming animals had certain makings of human intelligence, and that included the aspects of human consciousness. So even ants, out on a picnic once, Romanes observed one group of ants appearing to try to rescue another ant that had been injured, and he said, look, there's even evidence of fellow feeling and sympathy in ants. So he says, look, there's some kind of intelligence, some kind of consciousness, even in these animals, that is something like what we have. Romanes went on to argue, much like Darwin, that the idea of a discontinuity in mental faculties is just improbable, given what we know about evolution. Strong prima facie case in favor of the view that there's been no interruption of the developmental process in the course of psychological history. So again,